The observation deck of the Unified Command Station Orion 7 was silent except for the low hum of recycled air cycling through the vents. 40 cadets stood in perfect rows, 22 alien, 18 human, beneath cold white lights that cast no shadows and showed no mercy. The walls were polished obsidian steel, and in the center of the room, on a raised platform, stood General Zyrex of the Velthari Dominion. He was enormous. Standing nearly 8 feet at the shoulder, Zyrex was what his species had perfected over 3,000 years of unbroken warfare. His hide was the dull gray of sharpened basalt. His 4 arms were each the diameter of a grown man's torso, jointed at angles that suggested his skeleton had been engineered, not evolved. His eyes, 3 of them, set in a flat, broad face like gemstones pressed into stone, carried the particular heaviness of a being who had watched civilizations fall and felt nothing about it. He had crushed rebellion on 6 worlds. He had been assigned to the Academy as an insult. Or so he believed. "You are here," General Zyrex said, his voice a subsonic rumble that vibrated in the sternum before it reached the ears, "because your respective governments believe you deserve to stand in the same room as warriors. I do not share that belief. I will, however, give each of you a single opportunity to change my mind." He descended the steps from the platform slowly, moving between the rows of cadets with the patience of something geological. He paused to examine an Arati cadet's posture. Said nothing. Moved on. He tilted his head at a Solvan twin form, whose secondary body flinched. He noted it. Then he reached the human row. He had little opinion of humans. They had joined the Unified Command only 11 years ago, after the Convergence Wars had burned through 2/3 of the known systems and left everyone desperate enough to accept even short-lived, fragile, largely hairless primates into the coalition. He had read their species profile. Average lifespan, 80 years, if they were lucky. Bone density, embarrassing. Pressure tolerance, laughable. Emotional regulation, a documented liability in combat. And yet here they stood, in a row, backs straight, chins level, wearing the same gray uniform as everyone else, pretending they belonged. He stopped in front of the one called Mara Ellison. She was small. Not merely by Velthari standards, by human standards she was lean and compact, built close to the ground, with brown skin and short-cropped dark hair and a stillness about her that was either exceptional composure or the blankness of a being too simple to recognize danger. He studied her for a long moment. She did not look away. Most cadets looked away. The Arati looked at their feet. The Solvan looked at each other. Even some of the human cadets had dropped their gaze during his inspection, which he had marked and would remember. Mara Ellison looked directly at him. Not with aggression. Not with the brittle bravado of a being trying to prove something. She looked at him the way a person looks at a large rock they are calculating how to move. Analytical. Calm. Present. He didn't like it. "You," he said. "Sir," she said. "What is your primary combat discipline?" "Close quarters and joint manipulation, sir." "Secondary in ballistic and thrown." "Joint manipulation." He repeated the phrase the way one might repeat a joke that hadn't landed. He turned his 3 eyes to the rest of the room, inviting them to appreciate the humor of this. "You intend to manipulate the joints of beings 3 times your mass." "I intend to manipulate the joints of whatever is in front of me, sir." The room went very still. It was not the words. The words were technically within the bounds of acceptable cadet response. It was the tone. Not insubordinate. Not disrespectful. Simply factual. As if she had said water is wet or the station orbits a star. Matter of fact. Unperturbed. Zyrex had been spoken to with fear. With rage. With desperation and flattery and the elaborate performative deference of species who had learned that angering him was the last mistake many beings ever made. He was not accustomed to being spoken to as if he were simply another variable in an equation. He reached out with his lower left arm, the largest of his four, the one with the greatest reach, and struck her across the shoulder. Not full force. A fraction. The amount he used to test cadets, to see how they responded to sudden physical contact, to gauge instinct versus training. For most species, it knocked them sideways. For humans, given their bone density and center of mass, he expected her to stumble. She didn't stumble. What happened in the next 4 seconds was this. She moved into the strike rather than away from it, which was the opposite of what every instinct in every species in that room would have dictated. She turned her left shoulder into the blow, absorbing the force by rotating with it, and in that same motion her right hand shot up and closed around his wrist, the narrow articulation joint just above the heavy metacarpal plate, where even Velthory anatomy had to allow for flexibility. Her thumb found the pressure nexus without searching for it. She had studied Velthory anatomy. She had studied it with the same focus she applied to everything, which was the kind of focus that most beings with 80-year lifespans develop when they understand that time is not abundant. She had memorized the joint structure of 17 species currently serving in the Unified Command and 9 species classified as potential adversaries. She had practiced the relevant techniques on training dummies modeled from exoskeletal scans. She rotated her grip. There was a sound. It was not a dramatic sound. It was a small, precise, mechanical sound, the sound of a load-bearing structure being redirected past its tolerant threshold by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. General Zyrex's wrist fractured in 2 places. He did not cry out. He was Velthory. They did not cry out. But his 3 eyes blinked in rapid sequence, the Velthory equivalent of a sharp intake of breath, and his other 3 arms went rigid at his sides, which was the Velthory equivalent of a person stumbling. Mara released him. She stepped back to precisely where she had been standing. Chin level. Back straight. Expression unchanged. The room remained silent for a full 3 seconds, which in a space containing 40 combat-trained individuals representing 12 species felt approximately as long as a geological era. Then Zyrex looked at his wrist. He looked at it for a long moment. The fractures were clean, efficient, placed at the exact angles that would have, in a real combat scenario, rendered that arm non-functional while leaving the rest of him unharmed. It was not a move designed to destroy. It was a move designed to end. Precise. Economic. Ruthlessly intentional. He looked at Mara Ellison. She looked back at him the same way she had before. Still doing the math. Still calculating. Still present. You studied our anatomy, he said. All 17 currently serving species and 9 classified adversaries, she said. Velthory wrist is the most accessible high-value joint on your primary arm at standard engagement distance. I've been practicing the rotation for 8 months. 8 months. The angle changes depending on the arm being used. Your lower left has a 3-degree variance from the upper. I adjusted. General Zyrex was silent for a long time. He had been in combat for longer than her species had possessed written language. He had trained warriors who could tear warships apart with their hands. He had met beings of extraordinary physical capability, beings who could survive vacuum, who could regenerate severed limbs, who could process battlefield information at speeds that made organic thought look like standing water. He had never met a being who, upon being struck by a Velthory general, immediately neutralized the threat with 8 months of pre-calculated technique and then stood there looking at him like a problem she had already solved. He thought about the convergence wars. About the campaigns that had ended civilizations. About the 6 worlds that had rebelled and the 6 worlds that no longer held that distinction. About all the species he had evaluated and found wanting. He thought about an 80-year lifespan and what a person did with it when they took it seriously. Report to the advanced combat track, he said, his voice as flat and unreadable as it always was. You begin tomorrow. Sir, she said. He walked past her. He didn't look back. He had 3 more rows of cadets to inspect, and a wrist to have set, and a report to file with the unified command that would require him to answer questions he was not looking forward to answering. But as he climbed the steps back to the platform, the thought that remained, the one he couldn't set aside the way he could set aside a fracture, was this. She hadn't hesitated. Not for a fraction of a second. She had moved like someone who had already decided, long before the moment arrived, exactly what she would do when it came. That, he thought, with something he hadn't felt in a long time, is what dangerous looks like.